This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Climate change is presenting so many challenges in our region, but residents across New England are rising to the occasion. Today, we hear from reporters from the New England News Collaborative on new solutions to mitigating climate change. The NENC is spending the entire week spotlighting stories for Earth Day 2023, from green burials to eliminating construction waste and even climate-proofing our agriculture. We'll hear about different innovations that could make big impacts. We also want to hear from you. What are your communities doing to fight climate change where you live? You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. First up, we're going to hear from Lexi Krupp. She's the science and health reporter for Vermont Public. Thanks, Lexi, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about something super interesting this morning, which is the origins of green burials. Can you talk to us about sort of the history of it, and was this once common?
Yeah, thinking about green burials, which is just this idea of letting your body decompose underground, is like the oldest tradition ever. And it's still really the custom in Jewish and Muslim burials. It's pretty new in the last maybe couple hundred years that really America has been pioneered this like embalming, caskets, concrete vaults. A lot of what we associate with like a conventional cemetery now is the new thing. So letting your body decompose underground and like in a shroud or a plain wooden casket or pine box. That's the way people have been buried for forever.
So we're obviously going to be talking a lot about climate change and stories related to it, but was there a reason why this particular angle drew your attention?
Yeah, I had a neighbor who told me about a natural burial she had been to and how really powerful it was. And I actually heard that in a lot of cemeterians I talk to, people in the death care industry. They're like, yeah, this is, like a good thing for the environment, sure, but like really there's it's like helpful for people, like in terms of this terribly vulnerable time of losing a loved one, and having this like closure and connection can be really powerful, and a little more intimate. So that was a piece of this that, I got pretty interested in.
And so can you sort of walk us through, I think green burials were only recently legalized in certain places, and in many places you have to be buried in a vault and be buried at a certain depth. Can you sort of walk us through that?
Yeah, this is such an interesting history. So, unlike you're totally right. In a lot of individual cemetery bylaws, there's still these rules on the books that you have to be buried in a concrete vault, which is like a big box of concrete in the ground, underground. Like a lot of pollution, actually, if you think about it. But that came about over 100 years ago for a couple reasons. One was grave robbing was an issue in the late 1800s, early 1900s for medical students looking for cadavers. It was like a way to make money to sell these bodies for these medical schools. So that was like an issue in Vermont and all over New England, Mid-Atlantic. There's stories of grave robbers. So that was one way to like protect these bodies, was to require these concrete vaults. And then there was the development of germ theory, like, like dead bodies, like lots of bacteria and like things that are bad for us. So that was another reason to have these vaults and have these depths, like on the books. Until 2017 in Vermont, you had to bury people 6 feet, 5.5 or 6 feet deep. And that's like not a great place in the soil to encourage decomposition. It's a little below this active layer of soil where there's a lot of oxygen, there's more heat, there's more like microbes doing their thing. Yeah, and then finally, there's a more modern reason why some of these rules are still in the books to have these vaults, to have these depths, really the vaults, because of lawnmowers. If you are in a vault, you're gonna, the ground isn't gonna settle after, the body or the casket is decomposed a little bit. So it's going to stay even and level and easier for a lawnmower to go over there and to mow it. So that was like a couple of the things that there were, several people in Vermont working to change these rules a couple years ago. And those were some of the things they kept hearing, like, what about the lawnmowers? So they're like, I talked to a woman, she was like what, we're prioritizing lawnmowers over like how people, want to be buried? Like that's messed up. So yes, that these laws in Vermont changed in 2017.
Well, I wasn't thinking that I was ever going to think about lawn mowing and burials, and now you just paint me a very Victorian, gruesome picture for me to continue with my day. So thank you very much for that. And because you talked about cement boxes, and there's so many it's not great for the environment. But can you also get into embalming, because that's also something that's really difficult to break down in soil? Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, embalming is basically preserving, or it's it doesn't preserve the body. It's just slowing decomposition, and it's a really powerful thing. And especially if there's been trauma to a body, or it's something that is like still like if your loved one wants to be embalmed, like great. There's no like wrong way to I don't know, be buried, but there's lots of chemicals in those solutions used, formaldehyde, which is not great to have underground, to be going into the soil. And there's like some stats about folks who work in that industry having higher cancer rates and being more sick than the general population. So it's not great to be exposed to some of these chemicals, over your lifetime. But that is how like a lot of people do it. So that I think it's helpful to just know that there's an alternative. You don't have to, do things this way. Yeah.
So we kind of talked about, the traditional way of burials. And so can you kind of explain to, what does green burials look like actually, and where do they take place? Like, do they have to be in a certain type of cemetery, a certain type of location? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So first, I'll tell you about green burials or natural burials, which is instead of being 5.5 or 6 feet, it's a little shallower, like 3.5 feet. 3.5, 4 feet. So that's again to like encourage this decomposition. You've got to be in the right type of soil. So like if there's a lot of clay, it's not going to work well, because bodies, whatever things don't break down well in clay soil. It's year round. So like basically very soon after someone dies, they're going to be buried in the soil. And again, that's the tradition in Jewish and Muslim burials, but not always the tradition, like in Christian burials. And another reason why embalming is a technique that's used a lot is to, have that open casket and to let everyone come and fly in, and see this person. So yeah, they're going to want to be buried up in Vermont, it gets pretty cold here. The ground freezes, but year round have those burials taking place. And yeah, you can have flowers on top of there, whatever. They're usually not mowed very often. Yeah, those are sort of the elements. And then what my story was really looking at is how this is becoming more available at conventional cemeteries. So I'm going to give you a stat. In 2015, So not that long ago, there were maybe 5 cemeteries in all of New England that offered green burial. So all those things I just talked about, that shallower depth, and one piece I missed, but and now in 2023, there's well over 70. So it's something that's becoming a lot more common, a lot more accessible to people, that you don't have to drive hours and hours to go to like a special place. Like it's in, these things are available, like maybe in your town cemetery. And if not, you can like join your cemetery commission in your town and say, hey, I want to make this an option, and it could happen. Yeah, and the last piece I missed with what is a green burial is what you're buried in. So rather than a big casket with metal or something synthetic in there, it could be that you're just wrapped in a shroud, like on a pine board, or maybe a plain wooden box, no nails, anything that can decompose, become part of the earth. I know some people lay to rest in wicker baskets. So yeah, there's a pretty big range of options there.
I think it's pretty amazing that it's becoming so popular, and especially since we're a lot more environmentally conscious. And with what you just shared, I think it's the perfect transition. We're going to listen to a clip of an interview that you did with Patrick Healy, who's the director of Greenmount Cemetery in Montpelier and president of the Vermont Cemetery Association, and as well as Jennifer Whitman, who is the former Cemetery Commission in Calais, Vermont. And let's take a listen.
We didn't think it would take off as fast as it would. I'm getting a couple of emails a week from around the state, from how to be buried here or how can we get our cemetery to have natural burials. It is much bigger than I ever thought it would happen, because I don't know if it's because it's new or if people are just wanting something very environmentally friendly.
All you got to do is you do one natural burial, and you realize all of the benefits of it for the family, for the land. All of a sudden, it just all makes sense.
So with what both of them said, is it more or less expensive to do this, Lexi?
Oh, and I'm sorry, that last quote was actually from Lee Webster, not Jennifer Whitman, but she's like pretty big in the green burial world. I don't know her exact title, but so expense wise, in terms of comparing to cremation, which is actually the most common way to deal with the dead right now in New England and across the country. It's well over 50%, but in New England, it's like 70-80% of people who die choose cremation. So it depends like on a lot of things, but typically if you just are choosing cremation, that's going to be cheaper. It can be a couple $100. If you are choosing cremation and then a burial plot to have those where those cremated remains will be, often burial plots will be over $1,000. So that could be on par with the cost of a green burial. But I've seen between $2,000 and $3,000 in Vermont as the range here. There's definitely more expensive cemeteries, like there's a beautiful cemetery outside of Boston, Mount Auburn, where I think it costs maybe $8,000 or $9,000 to have both the plot there and the burial. So it's and then how that compares to like a conventional burial, it's often the same price or a little cheaper. And again, those conventional burials often have like a big monument, a headstone, which will, again, something typically different than a natural burial where you wouldn't have, maybe you'd have a flat granite marker on the ground, but not a big old headstone, which is going to cost you more money. So cheaper or the same price as a conventional burial, typically more expensive than cremation, running between $2,000 and $3,000 and maybe more.
And we've got about a minute left, but I do want to ask, you've been breaking down the financial costs for us, but what about the environmental costs? Like, do you know anything about the carbon footprint of a traditional burial versus a green burial?
Yeah. There's a stat from the Green Burials Association that a typical conventional burial is like 250 pounds of carbon. And that's from the cement, some of those embalming fluids. And here you're storing a little bit of carbon. I would, hesitate to call this carbon storage, but it's not like you're not the only thing that you're doing is using up some land. And there's some cemeteries that are working to have working with land trusts as a way to be like, let's preserve this land, let's conserve this land. So there's these Vermont forest cemetery, this idea of using cemeteries as land conservation. This to compare to cremation, that requires a little bit more energy to you've got this like hot fire that you're burning, and that requires energy to heat. So it's going to be less energy intensive than cremation for sure.
You've been listening to Lexi Krupp. She's a science and health reporter for Vermont Public. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, Lexi.
Thanks for having me.
You can check out more of her stories and creative ways to act on climate change by visiting nenc.news. And coming up next, we'll be talking with our very own Patrick Skahill here at Connecticut Public. He'll be on to chat about silvopasture and what exactly does that mean. You can join the conversation 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're back to continue our conversation about everything Earth Day 2023. Journalists from the New England News Collaborative are spending a week telling stories about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, environmental justice, and what's happening with climate efforts around the region. You can check out those stories by visiting nenc.news. And here to help us understand the concept of silvopasture is Patrick Skahill. He's Connecticut Public's reporter and digital editor, and he is now sitting across from me in the studio today. Welcome.
Hello, Kat. How are you?
Good. And we're so excited to have you to talk about silvopasture. So what exactly is that? And it sounds like this is not a new idea.
Yeah. So silvopasture is the intentional integration of trees, forage, so grasses, and livestock on the same unit of land. The trees are producing a crop. They're providing shade to the livestock. The forage is obviously grass that the cows can eat, or the sheep, or whatever you're pasturing out there. And the whole system is managed. And as you're saying, Kat, this is not a new idea. There are, indigenous communities obviously did this for generations, longer than that in New England. It's gone on for thousands of years in parts of Europe. So not a new idea, but it's one that's kind of coming back here in New England, because for a long time, when settlers came here, if you go hiking out in the woods, you see stone walls everywhere, right? They came in, they cleared trees, they cleared stones for farmland, and that's how they did farming. But now we're kind of thinking like, hey, there's a lot of trees. Maybe we should sort of integrate those into our farm landscapes.
So it sounds like we're going back full circle a little bit. And so how is this different from what we normally see? Is there a reason why it's not integrated more? Because it seems more natural, but why do you think we're just getting back to it now?
Yeah, so I think when I first came to the story, when I pictured a cow grazing in a field, I pictured a big open field, right? That's sort of what you envision. You see a big open field, which can have benefits for a farmer. It's a lot easier to manage, right? You don't have to do things to kind of keep the soil healthy and all that. But it's not so great for the grass, because if it gets really hot or sunny and there's no shade, the grass burns off, it turns brown. The animals can't eat that. Obviously, it's also bad for the animals. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a party in the middle of the summer when it's really hot. It gets miserable really quick. So just like us, you wouldn't want to be, a cow doesn't want to be out eating in that kind of weather.
Well, I love that you describe that because being from California, I actually do see a lot of cows in brown fields. So now I'm like, are they actually getting the nutrients that they're supposed to be getting? Someone can get the answer for me. So we want to also hear from one of the farmers that you profiled. Who we're going to hear from is Joe Ore-Fichet. He is a lecturer at the Yale School of Environment and the owner of Hidden Blossom Farm here in Connecticut. Let's take a listen.
When you have a drought, the grass in a treeless pasture just stops. Like last summer, 2022, it was dry. I was still grazing. Well, my cows were still grazing. I don't eat grass, but the cows were grazing, and that was because I had silvopasture. It's 95 degrees and humid. Do you want to be out there eating a full buffet? You don't want to do that. As a human, you're going to be like, this is miserable.
Yeah, so I kind of stole Joe's thunder there a little bit, but he makes the same idea, right? There are animal welfare benefits to this, but there's also climate resiliency benefits to farmers for this. If you have a system that is a little bit more resilient to drought, which is happening more frequently here, we're seeing warmer weather here in Connecticut and all across New England. Then as a farmer, you can kind of shake that off a little bit, and that's kind of almost like economic. It's almost sort of like insurance for you, right? It's sort of a free insurance policy that you can have to manage your land.
So does this mean that there will be more biodiversity to help the soil if we do kind of go back to the non-open field scenario? And in turn, does that help the crops?
Yeah. So one of the key benefits of this is one of the key things you need to do in this type of system, right, is manage it. So what does managing a silvopasture system mean? Well, what it isn't is if you have a bunch of pigs, just releasing them into the forest and saying, go at it, go ahead and graze and forage and find mushrooms, because the pigs will just destroy the woods. And one farmer I talked to actually said he did that, and his forest, basically turned into a moonscape. They just came in, and trees that took 60 years to grow were destroyed in 60 minutes, and he was like, this isn't working. So one thing that is sort of key to these types of systems is what's called rotational grazing. So you take your animals out, you would put them in what's called a paddock, which is sort of a managed space in a forested area, and you let them graze there for a day or two, and then you move them to let the soil recover. And if you do that right, you're going to have soil that's healthier. It's going to be getting excrement from the animals. It's going to be getting the right amount of sunlight from the sky, because the trees are going to be spaced properly. That's going to allow the grass to grow, the forage to grow, which is going to make it more resilient against things like erosion from the wind or the rain, and it's going to make it more resilient to drought as well.
So I had no idea that pigs can be so destructive and helpful at the same time. And so we've got about 2 minutes left, but I do want to ask you, it sounds kind of obvious, but how does this help to manage climate change, and what does this look like at scale?
Yeah, so here in New England, the primary benefit for farmers is mitigation against drought. So again, when you have this type of land, the soil holds water better, and it's able to deal with dry periods much better. So the grass doesn't get all brown, and the cows can continue to forage, as Joe was saying. So here in Connecticut and in New England, it's not so much a climate mitigation thing. Yeah, obviously, if you leave a few trees standing up in farmland, that's better than clear cutting the entire thing, because carbon in trees and carbon in soil is better than carbon in the atmosphere. But it's more of an adaptation mechanism, I would say, in New England.
And just real quickly, what might this look like for farmers in the future? Buying land and not completely clearing out the forest. Like, are there challenges in doing that?
Yeah, there's also another economic benefit here too, particularly if you rent farmland, which is it's a lot easier to rent land that has trees on it versus going in and renting a treeless pasture. So that's another benefit that farmers said too. You can go in and buy a plot of farmland that's forested, maybe clear it out just a little bit to allow for a silvopasture to be set up, and that's going to be a lot more affordable than going in and buying a clear-cut plot of land.
You've been listening to Patrick Skahill. He's our reporter here at Connecticut Public, as well as a digital editor. Thanks so much for spending time with us today and explaining to us what silvopasture is.
You're welcome.
Up next, we're going to hear from a journalist from WCAI in Massachusetts who's been reporting on construction waste and how some companies are paving the way to do better recycling. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. It's our April Fund Drive. If you're enjoying what you're hearing this hour and want to support our radio station with a pledge, you can go online to ctpublic.org/donate. Just a quick reminder for our listeners out there. And to continue our conversation on all things climate related for Earth Day 2023 is Eve Zuckoff. She's a climate and environmental journalist for CAI, and she's here to talk about the impacts of construction waste. Eve, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Honestly, I'm having one of those moments where I'm like, this is a huge area when it comes to waste, and I just never think about it until I read your report. So Eve, can you talk about how did you get the story idea and the process of you learning about the amount of construction waste that's produced every year? Was it a surprise to you?
Oh my gosh, absolutely it was. I think it will be to most people. I can't wait to kind of roll that out slowly here in this conversation. But to drum it up a little bit before we get there, this story came to me a little bit randomly. My editor was having a conversation with someone at his kid's school dance, and they said, "Have you heard of this company on Cape Cod called Waste Not?" They are this. They recycle construction materials from homes before they're torn down. And he said, "I never heard of this. Our climate environment reporter, Eve Zuckoff, would love to hear about this." And he was right. So I spent the day with this company called Waste Not. I have so much more to say about the women who run that company. But basically, it introduced me to this world of construction and demolition waste. And drum roll, please, here for the number. 30 to 40% of what ends up in our landfills is just construction and demolition waste. And that's everything from the carpets that you rip out of your house when you get a new set of kitchen cabinets. It's obviously a bigger project. It's new floorboards. It's so many things that we kind of many people can exchange in their homes without really thinking twice about the waste, but it really adds up in our landfills.
I was going to do a drum roll sound, but I didn't think I was going to be able to do that stat justice, so did not go there. But you mentioned the women that you talked to for Waste Not, and yes, let's definitely drum roll on that. And can you tell us about that experience and what did they do?
Yeah, so there are these two women named Anne and Liz who live on Cape Cod. And basically, they had worked in the construction industry as developers for 25 years in kind of the greater Boston area. And they would build new apartments and kind of do all kinds of traditional developer activities. And when they both moved to Cape Cod, they had just this lifetime of experience realizing, oh my God, there were so many times where we would go into a building to do a gut renovation and we would just throw away all of this stuff that could be put to better use by somebody who needs it. And so I spent a good amount of time, a full day with Anne and Liz, seeing kind of soup to nuts, a bunch of different things that they do. I didn't get a chance to go with them to a job site where they actually tear everything out of a house, but they took me to their storage garage where they keep so many of the things that they pull out of homes. And so it's this storage garage that's just filled with bathroom vanities in perfect condition, new fridges, a 2-year-old boiler was there. It was just in perfect condition. Transom windows, antique doors. I mean, you name it. This garage was stuffed to the brim. And I also went with them to a woman's home. And this woman had been given a bunch of materials by Anne and Liz to build an in-law suite for her mother who has Parkinson's, who was going to move into her home soon, and a little playhouse in her backyard for her children and foster children.
And did you learn how did Anne and Liz get into this? Because I feel like a lot of things, it feels very self-explanatory, but it took the two women to sort of explore this and turn it into like a real thing.
Yeah, I mean, and so what they're doing, the technical term for it is deconstruction. That's what they're experts in. I think, as I mentioned, just doing construction for so many years, I think it kind of caught up to them and they were like, we can do something else. And the real drive, the thing that, as they said, gets them to a freezing cold job site in the middle of winter, is to get materials that they're pulling out of these homes to people who need them. They were telling me just stories upon stories of the people who end up inheriting these perfectly good materials that are pulled from homes. So the day that I was with them, they said, oh yeah, you see those massive Anderson sliding glass doors? Those are going to a local firefighter. He's a veteran. He's coming to pick those up later today for a house that first-time homeowner that he just bought. They had given a bunch of materials to a single mom who had 3 kids. They got her dishwasher broke, and that's a big expense. So they went over there with a new dishwasher, a brand new dishwasher, basically. So I think that is what keeps them going. But this idea of deconstruction, they didn't invent it. It's actually bigger on the West Coast, is what they were telling me. There's much more of kind of a community out there, and actually some local bylaws that require much more deconstruction-minded activities, especially in the building world. And so I think they kind of saw what was going on and didn't see anything in our community, and just realized we will not make nearly as much money as we did in the construction world, but this is important. We can make a difference in our community this way.
And did you get a gist of how much they were able to sort of salvage or recycle? And do they resell it or donate it, or what does that look like?
Yeah, the way that their business works is about 90% of what they pull from homes is donated. And that's kind of a very important part of this, because the way that this is financially worthwhile for homeowners that want to do a deconstruction on their home or beach home is that you can get a tax write-off if you donate for everything you donate. So Anne and Liz, most of what they are able to pull out of a home that's being deconstructed goes straight to a resale shop in Western Massachusetts. It's loaded onto 26-foot trucks, shipped there right away, and then some of what they're able to pull out goes to their storage garage where I was with them. And that's often the stuff that they say, we want to keep this here because we know this is going to fly out of here. Like fridges are always really helpful to keep around. Dishwashers, they said they keep dishwashers. They can't keep dishwashers for more than a couple days at a time. So they keep those, but 90%, of what's coming out of these homes is donated. And they're able to pull up an enormous amount. Like I was asking them to quantify for me, what are you getting exactly? And they said they've pulled up over an acre of hardwood flooring and diverted it from landfills in the last several years since they started this company, just 2017. They've saved roughly 570 kitchen cabinets and 500 windows. Those are bigger items, but sometimes they'll even go into homes. And, I'm talking to you from Cape Cod, where we have an incredible disparity between the wealthiest and the poorest people who live here. And the wealthiest people can buy beachfront properties and then gut them completely and turn them into beautiful, beautiful mansions by the sea. And sometimes they were telling me they'll go into those and, that home before they'll open up a little closet and there'll still be linens, or in the middle of, the kitchen inside a cabinet, there'll be martini glasses. So they're pulling everything from, incredibly heavy boilers to martini glasses out of homes.
That sounds like the most amazingly ridiculous yard sale that can ever happen. And I mean, that's so much flooring and so many kitchen cabinets. I cannot believe it. But I think you paint a great picture, because I think it really shows us the sort of the enormity of what they're able to salvage and what we're actually using for these properties. And so we're going to hear from Felix Heiser, who teaches architecture and directs the Circular Construction Lab at Cornell University, as well as Anne, who you profiled for this piece. Can you tell us a little bit about both of them?
Yeah, so I'll start with Anne, because I just had so much fun talking to her, honestly. Anne Jarosowicz is a person who spent years and years in development, and she just a couple years ago started this company with her friend Liz, and has just watched it taken off. And she's a little bit of she's got like a tough Bostonian thing about her, but just the biggest heart. And actually her dream with all of these materials, someday I'll just throw out there for any investors listening to your show, I'm sure they are. She really wants to kind of adapt the company into something that allows her to build tiny homes out of all these materials. They're often, if you have windows, doors, flooring, kitchen cabinet stuff, bathroom stuff. Like you could actually build little kits of tiny homes out of what they rescue. So she's a dreamer and she's a helper in the world. And then Felix Heisel, it's this German professor at Cornell University who just thinks in incredibly deep ways about all the different things that go into how we build homes and buildings and how we make them more sustainable going forward. So I think that there's actually a lovely contrast between the two of them, both helpers, but in very different pockets and needed pockets.
Well, let's take a listen to those pockets right now.
Methane emissions from landfills, for example, are one of the key drivers of global warming. 40% of the volume of our landfills are just construction waste. And so this is an enormous problem.
So in 2018, 600 million tons of waste was created by construction and demo debris. 600 million tons. I mean, that's insane. It's absolutely insane. And as you see, this stuff is really useful. You come across these materials and it just feels crappy to throw this stuff in a dumpster because you know somebody somewhere needs it.
I think the numbers in these pockets is pretty alarming. You've got 40% of the volume of landfills are just construction waste, while in 2018, 600 million tons of waste was created by construction and demo debris. So this leads to a lot of different ways of, like we've been saying, salvaging, recycling, and whatnots. Upcycling furniture has also become another trend in recent years, but it seems to be much more than that. Is that the case, Eve?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that Anne and Liz are absolutely champions of upcycling, but what they're doing is something different. It's saying, because I think upcycling, in my mind at least, there's this image of, you can go to a thrift store and buy a beautiful, but maybe seen better days dresser, give it a fresh sanding, coat of paint, sell it on Facebook Marketplace for a markup. And that's great for people to make money. It's great to keep, things out of the waste stream. But I think what Liz and Anne are trying to do with deconstruction is actually much bigger than that. What they're really hoping to do is donate everything that they're pulling out of homes. They're also kind of accepting implicit in the work that they do that just because something maybe has seen 20, 30 years of life doesn't mean it needs that fresh coat of paint. I mean, the homeowners who they end up giving this stuff to are more than welcome to transform the things that end up with them. But I think that there's something actually really important about saying so much of what we already have is perfectly good, and it doesn't need all the bells and whistles that I think we require, or some people feel that they need to have more aesthetic homes. Like some things are just well built and they're ready for a new home instead of, us going out to a big box store and buying something fresh. So I don't want to poo-poo upcycling, but I think that there's something a little philosophically different about what they do.
And so I guess that also leads to my next question is, should we be changing the materials that we use in construction and rethink how we build houses, especially, focusing on preserving existing buildings and so not constructing new ones? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I talked at length about with Felix Heisel from Cornell. And he was saying, deconstruction is great, but before we even get to deconstruction, what we should be doing is looking at buildings and homes that exist. And instead of tearing them down, our first question should be, okay, well, maybe that building is at the end of its useful life in this capacity, but how can we adapt it to be something else? How do we keep the structure there, keep the kitchen in this spot, but build an extra room or build, add something to a building rather than tearing down an enormous amount and using new materials for it. So the first thing we should be looking to do is just adapt a building. And then I think another part of his work, because he's looking at every part of a building's life cycle, is when we are building a new building or when we do decide to adapt and we're bringing in new materials, how do we choose materials that take in the building's entire next 20, 30, 40, ideally 50, 100 years of it being up. So how do we install carpeting that isn't put down with toxic glues and adhesives? Like, there are ways to have better versions of so many of the materials that we use. And that's new materials, but also, again, even better is secondhand materials. If there's a building that has to be torn down, how do we really carefully do what Anne and Liz do and, pry up each floorboard individually so that can go into a new home? I say that knowing that it is more time, and more cost to do deconstruction than just plain old demolition. Felix Heisel was telling me, to do deconstruction, you need roughly 6 times more laborers than on a construction site.
And sorry, Eve, I do have to interrupt just because we're running out of time.
Sure. I'm sorry.
Worries. You've been listening to Eve Zuckoff. She's a climate and environmental journalist for CEI, and she's been reporting on the impacts on construction waste. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Corey Princell of the New England News Collaboration contributed to this report. Thank you so much for listening today.